Hey guys, tonight we are going to tiptoe through the incredibly confusing calendar of gratitude, slipping through centuries and across continents to understand how different countries decide when to celebrate Thanksgiving. You are floating now, a gentle presence drifting back to the early 1620s. The air here is sharp, sea-salted, and smells faintly of wood smoke and damp wool. You aren't wearing shoes, just thick, knitted stockings, and the packed earth beneath your feet feels cold and unforgiving. You're standing on the edge of a fledgling settlement known as Plymouth, surrounded by scratchy clapboard structures huddled against the immense, indifferent wilderness of coastal North America. The scene is not the cozy, idealized lithograph you might have imagined. It is raw, muddy, and still shadowed by the brutal loss of the previous winter. Look closely at the people here. The survivors, they are thin. Their clothing is serviceable but worn, and their faces carry the weight of tremendous struggle. This particular moment is September or October of 1621, and a great harvest has just been brought in. A miraculous bounty, really, considering the learning curve these new arrivals faced. You see a gathering taking place. It's loud, but not in a boisterous, modern holiday way. It's the murmur of relief, the clatter of hastily assembled wooden tables, and the sound of muskets firing. Yes, muskets. 3 days of celebratory feasting are unfolding, driven by a deep, palpable sense of shared survival. The central figures are the English separatists, the Pilgrims, as they later become known, and about 90 members of the Wampanoag tribe, including their leader, Massasoit. You look at the food: wild fowl, maybe some venison, definitely corn and squashes that the Wampanoag had taught the settlers to cultivate. There is no pumpkin pie. There is certainly no fluffy mashed potato or gelatinous canned cranberry sauce. If you dared to ask someone for a marshmallow-topped sweet potato casserole, you'd probably get a look that suggested you were suffering from a fevered delusion, or perhaps a vision from the devil. And honestly, modern Thanksgiving food is so decadent, you probably wouldn't survive the 17th century equivalent. Your colon is simply too pampered. What you are witnessing is a Thanksgiving, not the Thanksgiving. That is the fundamental historical quirk that you must absorb before settling down for the night. This 3-day feast was, for the Pilgrims, a harvest festival, a spontaneous moment of gratitude and diplomatic outreach to the native people who had saved them. It was not, repeat not, an inaugural annual tradition. They didn't sit down at the end and say, "Right, chaps, see you next year for the same thing, same time, maybe bring a better recipe for eels." It was a one-off. It was a thank you that happened to be delicious and lasted 72 hours. This is a crucial distinction. In their religious framework, a Thanksgiving was a religiously designated day of prayer and solemn gratitude, often for a specific miraculous event, like the end of a drought or a military victory. And they rarely involved massive feasts. A day of religious fasting was just as likely to be called as a day of feasting. You watch as Massasoit sits patiently, observing the slightly awkward European dances, and you can sense the complex political negotiations and alliances swirling beneath the surface of the shared meal. It wasn't purely idyllic. It was necessary. It was strategic. This is the mainstream historical fact that anchors the American Thanksgiving narrative. The 1621 event was a shared harvest feast with the Wampanoag people, but it was not immediately adopted as a holiday. Now, lean in closer to the fire. Smell the roasting meat. You notice one of the pilgrims, a woman named Eleanor, diligently collecting the rendered fat into a small wooden bowl. Why? Because the pilgrim women, and particularly the separatists who held rigid views on self, sufficiency and resource management, considered nothing waste. They would use every scrap. You might think they were just being frugal. But this frugality bordered on the obsessive. It was almost a religious duty to be efficient, a peculiar, fringe tidbit that highlights how profoundly different their mindset was from our own. Imagine having to conserve every single drop of animal grease for cooking, lighting, or rudimentary soap. Talk about pressure! You can practically hear the gentle, repetitive scraping sound of fat being rendered. A strangely comforting sound, if you let it wash over you. The decades that followed this 1621 meal saw erratic, region-specific days of Thanksgiving declared throughout the New England colonies. They were responses to specific, immediate circumstances, the safe arrival of a supply ship, the cessation of a smallpox outbreak, or yes, a particularly good harvest in a specific town. These were localized events declared by governors or religious leaders, entirely disconnected from the memory of the Plymouth gathering you are currently watching. It's important to remember this erratic schedule because it explains why there was so much confusion later on. You feel the ground beneath your feet shift, the smoke of the 1621 fires fading, and you move forward in time, slipping through the colonial period. You are now seeing a montage of proclamations, pieces of parchment nailed to wooden posts in various New England towns. They all declare a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, but the dates are wildly inconsistent, sometimes March, sometimes December, sometimes June. It's like trying to book a weekend getaway when the calendar keeps changing its mind. This inconsistency led to the ongoing academic debate that forms the intellectual heart of this story. Historians still argue whether the enduring popularity of the concept of an annual national Thanksgiving stems more from the political needs of the new American Republic's era, which we will get to, or from the persistent but localized religious traditions of the Puritans and Pilgrims, who used these days to reinforce community bonds. Was it a political act or a spiritual custom? The answer, as always, is a murky blend. As the 18th century approaches, the colonial leaders start to realize that designating these days of communal reflection or feasting could be a powerful tool for social cohesion. When you are trying to forge a unified identity out of disparate, squabbling colonies, having a shared, mandatory day off to think about being grateful and being American is a stroke of political genius, even if the timing is still purely chaotic. You can almost hear the soft scratching of quill pens signing these various, contradictory orders, a sound designed to lull you into a deep, historical slumber. Imagine trying to explain this to a time traveler from the future who is obsessed with efficiency. So, you have a holiday, but it's whenever the governor feels like it. Yes, and the reason changes every year. Precisely, the entire structure of these early Thanksgivings was based on need, not tradition. The tradition was only being slowly, haphazardly built, brick by inconsistent brick. You notice one last detail from a 1705 proclamation. It mandates a day of thanksgiving for the remarkable preservation of the province from the late dreadful tempest. This is the quirky tidbit. The tempest A ferocious storm that had thankfully done minimal damage was considered a gift, a near disaster averted, which in the Puritan mind was just as worthy of praise as a bountiful harvest. It suggests a deeply anxious worldview, doesn't it? Being thankful that things didn't get worse. It's a very different kind of gratitude than just being thankful for a big turkey dinner. Imagine if every time you narrowly avoided a fender bender on the highway, you had to call your entire extended family over for a 3-day celebration. It would be exhausting, but historically accurate. The stage is now set for a young nation to attempt to bring order to this festive chaos. The concept is there, a national pause for gratitude, but the when is still a massive, floating question mark. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the early American settlement fade away, the gentle creak of the well, the soft rhythmic sawing of timber, the distant, hypnotic thwack of an axe. The sheer effort of establishing this new world required a constant state of thankfulness, and it is this underlying, exhausting pressure that you are feeling now, a pressure that slowly begins to ease. As you realize you are merely an observer, allowed to relax into the rhythm of history. The Plymouth feast has faded, but the idea of a collective thank you is still echoing through the landscape, waiting for the right moment and the right political mind to solidify its place on the calendar. This journey is slow, but it is necessary. You are learning that the answer to "How did Thanksgiving land on the fourth Thursday of November?" is a surprisingly complex story of religion, politics, economics, and one very determined 19th century magazine editor. You realize that you are not just studying a holiday, you are studying the slow, arduous, and sometimes gently humorous process of nation building through shared ritual. Now, drift forward into the turmoil of the Revolutionary War era, where the concept of Thanksgiving would be briefly, but powerfully, weaponized for the cause of independence. Sleep now. Let the sounds of colonial life recede, replaced by the soft whisper of paper being unrolled in the halls of early governance. You are now immersed in the anxious, charged atmosphere of the late 18th century, the era of revolution. The colonial days of sporadic, local Thanksgivings are giving way to something larger, more unified, and overtly political. You find yourself standing not in a muddy village, but in the polished, candlelit chambers where the Continental Congress is meeting. The air is thick with the scent of ink and the low, urgent murmur of men contemplating treason against the crown. It is a dangerous, exhilarating time. The concept of a formalized, National Day of Thanks emerges here, not from a desire for a collective turkey feast, but from a strategic need to unify the disparate colonies and give a spiritual legitimacy to their armed struggle. The earliest, grandest, and most widely proclaimed Thanksgivings came during the American Revolution. After the pivotal victory at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, a mainstream historical fact that secured French aid and turned the tide of the war. Congress felt an overwhelming need to acknowledge this divine intervention. You watch as the delegates debate the wording. They need a day of public thanksgiving and praise, a deliberate pause to credit God for the success of their rebellion. This is the first time the nascent country, acting through its legislative body, dictates a unified calendar date for a day of communal gratitude, distinct from the regional declarations of the past. The Continental Congress issues its first Thanksgiving proclamation on November 1, 1777, recommending December 18th as the date. It's an exercise in political theology, effectively saying our cause is just, and heaven agrees. This practice continued intermittently throughout the war. You observe the rhythm of these revolutionary Thanksgivings often. They were declared after major military or diplomatic success, or simply to boost morale during a particularly grueling campaign. They were moments of high drama and high stakes. The power of the concept was clear. It bound the citizens together, forcing them to pause their individual struggles to acknowledge a shared national blessing. But still, this was not an annual holiday, fixed in stone. It was reactive. It was a political tool. Once the war was won and the United States Constitution was ratified, the question of a national Thanksgiving Day fell directly onto the shoulders of the first president, George Washington. You witness a fascinating political debate taking shape in New York City, the temporary capital. Washington, always the pragmatist and the unifying figure, understood the immense symbolic value of a national day of thanks. On October 3, 1789, he issued a proclamation, this time establishing Thursday, November 26th, as a day for Americans to render sincere and humble thanks. This is a crucial step, a presidential decree setting a national date. This is the first attempt to truly formalize the tradition. Now, here's a quirky tidbit about Washington's Thanksgiving. It wasn't universally welcomed. Many people, particularly anti-federalists and those cautious about the centralization of power, viewed the president's proclamation as an overreach. They argued, quite fiercely, that setting days of religious observance should remain the exclusive domain of state governors and local church leaders. They saw it as an echo of European monarchy, a dangerous blending of church and state. Imagine the debate. Washington says, "Let's all be thankful on November 26th. And someone shouts back, "Stay in your lane, Mr. President." It was a genuine constitutional and cultural friction point that historians often gloss over in favor of the turkey narrative. Washington's initial attempt to institutionalize the holiday was therefore sporadic and ultimately failed to stick. He proclaimed a few more days, notably in 1795, but Thomas Jefferson, his successor, flatly refused to issue any Thanksgiving proclamations. Jefferson, a staunch advocate for the separation of church and state, considered the idea unconstitutional, viewing it as a distinctly European, top-down religious imposition on the populace. So, for a time, the national holiday fizzled out at the presidential level, reverting to a patchwork of state and regional observances. The chaos returned. You watch as the calendar pages flip rapidly through the first half of the 19th century, observing that Thanksgiving remains popular, particularly in New England, but it has no national unity. Different states celebrated on different days, some in October, some in November, some not at all. It was a logistical nightmare for families with relatives living across state lines. This brings us to one of the central forces that finally drove the standardization of the American holiday: a dedicated, almost obsessive, civilian campaigner. This is where a mainstream historical fact meets gentle sarcasm. Enter Sarah Josepha Hale. You see her now? Sitting at a formidable mahogany desk, quill scratching furiously. She was the influential editor of the popular Godey's Lady's Book, essentially the Vogue and Good Housekeeping of the 19th century combined. Hale believed passionately that a unified, national Thanksgiving holiday, celebrated consistently across all states, was necessary to preserve American values and unity. For 36 years, yes, 36 years, she tirelessly wrote editorials, recipe stories, and letters to every single president and governor, urging them to adopt the holiday and fix the date. Her campaign was relentless, and she used the emotional power of domesticity and shared ritual as a gentle political weapon. She wasn't arguing for a military victory celebration. She was arguing for pie and family, a far more persuasive argument. As it turns out, if you think your email inbox is annoying, imagine receiving decades of persuasive letters from the 19th century's most popular magazine editor about Turkey. Her ultimate success lay in her ability to link the regional, New England tradition to the larger narrative of American exceptionalism and unity. She gave the holiday its aesthetic, its moral mandate, and its cultural anchor. She defined the menu, the spirit, and the necessary familial obligation. Historians still argue whether Hale's campaign was purely patriotic, or if it was also a clever way to boost the circulation of her magazine by aligning her publication with a potential national institution. Perhaps it was both, a perfect synergy of civic duty and good business sense, a very American combination. The final, decisive moment in establishing the date wouldn't come until the country was literally tearing itself apart. But before we get there, let's consider a final, quirky detail from this era. In the early 19th century, in some parts of the mid-Atlantic, Thanksgiving was sometimes celebrated twice in the same season. One date would be set by a proclamation, and another, later date, might be unofficially observed as Forefathers' Day, to specifically commemorate the Pilgrim landing. Imagine the confusion: two massive, mandatory family meals in the span of a few weeks. It suggests that while the Americans wanted the holiday, they had a deeply confusing time deciding on its official identity or its place on the calendar. You are observing a national culture slowly, painfully coalescing around a single, specific day of the year, driven by a powerful editor and the looming shadow of civil conflict. The constant, repetitive arguments over when the holiday should be are starting to sound like a low, soothing hum, a historical white noise designed to help you relax. Now drift forward into the war that would finally settle the matter. You are now standing in the year 1863, and the air is thick with the metaphorical and literal dust of war. The American Civil War is ripping the young nation apart. You can hear the distant, heavy thud of cannons, a mournful sound that underlies the entire existence of this era. Unity is the scarcest resource, and the need for a shared ritual, a collective moment of spiritual and emotional respite, has never been greater. This chaotic backdrop is where the national, fixed date for American Thanksgiving is finally forged, largely thanks to the persistent efforts of Sarah Josepha Hale, the magazine editor we met earlier, and the pivotal decision of President Abraham Lincoln. A mainstream historical fact that gives the holiday its modern footing. Hale had been relentlessly petitioning presidents for decades, but Lincoln, managing the impossible task of holding the Union together, recognized the strategic genius of her idea. In 1863, the Union had just secured pivotal, though bloody, victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. While the war was far from over, these successes offered a glimmer of hope and, crucially, a reason for collective gratitude. Lincoln saw an opportunity to use a national holiday as a political tool for healing and, paradoxically, for reinforcing the idea of a singular, enduring nation, even while half of it was in open rebellion. You watch as Lincoln signs the proclamation on October 3, 1863. He designates the last Thursday of November as a nationwide day of Thanksgiving. This is the moment the erratic, regional tradition achieves national permanence. The choice of the last Thursday was a nod to Washington's earlier proclamation, honoring the established tradition of New England observances, which generally fell late in the harvest season. Imagine the gentle irony here. A holiday about unity is officially mandated at the precise moment of maximum disunity. The proclamation was technically only binding in the Union states, but it was drafted with the clear intention of applying to the entire nation, claiming the South as wayward territory that would eventually rejoin the common observance. The date choice was simple, consistent, and easy to remember, a huge step up from the "whenever the governor feels like it" system. You can practically hear the sigh of relief from families trying to plan their travel between states that finally had a shared calendar. Sigh if you think planning Christmas travel is a nightmare. Try coordinating a feast when the states next door are celebrating 2 weeks apart. You drift into a Union Army camp in the late fall of 1863. The soldiers, far from home, are given a special meagre meal, a symbolic attempt to recreate the domestic warmth of a distant home. You see them sharing hardtack and a tiny ration of salted pork, maybe a bit of canned fruit. It is a profoundly moving, quiet observance. This is the reality behind the proclamation. The holiday wasn't about lavish abundance. It was about acknowledging blessings despite hardship. Now for a quirky tidbit. Before the Civil War, New Englanders often celebrated Thanksgiving with a distinctly odd set of games. One popular tradition was snapping the whippet, a game that historians describe as a cross between hide and seek and aggressive tag, usually involving blindfolds and often resulting in minor injuries. Another, even stranger custom involved young men traveling from house to house in disguise, sometimes wearing painted masks or blackened faces, demanding treats and causing minor mischief, a strange parallel to modern Halloween, but performed on Thanksgiving. This tradition was particularly strong in Connecticut and was called rags. It highlights the fact that the holiday was not always the staid, formal affair we imagine. It had a playful, sometimes rowdy, and even slightly menacing side, far removed from the gentle hum of polite dinner conversation. As the years passed after the war, Lincoln's proclamation became entrenched. Every subsequent president, continuing the precedent, proclaimed Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. The habit had finally stuck. The when of American Thanksgiving was settled, but not yet enshrined in law, relying solely on a presidential proclamation each year. The inherent problem with choosing the last Thursday of the month is the calendar itself. Some years have 5 Thursdays in November. In a 4-Thursday year, the last Thursday falls early, maximizing the time between Thanksgiving and Christmas, which delighted merchants. In a 5-Thursday year, the last Thursday falls late, sometimes just days before Christmas. This minimized the shopping window, which worried the retailers, a problem that will return to haunt us. Historians still argue whether Lincoln chose the last Thursday deliberately to maximize the holiday's distance from the chaos of the election cycle. which had occurred earlier in the month, or if he simply adopted the established tradition of the popular New England state observances, which preferred the latest possible date. You stand back and admire the simple effectiveness of the decision. A shared, annual, national ritual, cemented by the trauma of war, finally overriding the chaotic state by state variations. The soft scratching of Sarah Josepha Hale's pen stops forever, her decades-long quest complete. You listen to the sounds of a nation slowly rebuilding, the gentle clatter of train wheels carrying goods, the low murmur of people returning to normalcy, all punctuated by the annual, predictable rhythm of the late November holiday. It's a comforting, repetitive sound, perfect for easing you into a deeper rest. The American date is stable for now, but a quick trip north of the border reveals an entirely different historical foundation for the holiday, resting on earlier, and frankly colder, circumstances. You are now smoothly transitioning north, across the vast, chill expanse of the Great Lakes, and into the slightly more reserved, crisper air of Canada. Leave the American Civil War behind. The history here moves to an entirely different rhythm and an earlier date. You are standing in the late 16th century, long before the Pilgrims even thought about sailing to Plymouth. The core difference between the Canadian and American Thanksgivings is rooted in geography, climate, and the distinct nature of the founding expeditions. The origin story of the Canadian celebration traces back to the very cold north, to a place where harvest success was always less certain. You are drifting over the shores of Baffin Island in 1578, a place where the wind bites sharply and the landscape is stark and unforgiving. You observe the English explorer Martin Frobisher, a mainstream historical fact, leading his third expedition in search of the Northwest Passage. Frobisher, having failed to find the passage and losing one of his ships, decided to hold a formal ceremony of thanks. He and his crew were grateful for surviving the perilous voyage across the Atlantic and enduring the harsh Arctic conditions. It was a formal, religious service led by a minister named Robert Woolfall, focused on gratitude for preservation rather than abundance. This event, held somewhere around the current Dei Iqaluit, is often cited as the first Thanksgiving celebrated in North America, predating the Plymouth feast by 43 years. You see the men huddled together in the immense, frozen landscape, their voices small against the vastness. It wasn't a feast of plenty, it was a prayer of survival. The mood is solemn, focused, and definitely lacking in the casual humor of your modern dinner table. This foundational event establishes a key theme in Canadian Thanksgiving. It is often tied to military and survival success rather than purely agricultural abundance. The tradition evolved haphazardly over the next few centuries, following the pattern of sporadic, situational declarations seen in the American colonies. Days of Thanksgiving were proclaimed after major military victories, such as the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, which secured British dominance over New France. These were nationalistic, political statements. The real key to the Canadian date, the quirky tidbit that settles its observance in October, is simple climate reality. Canadian harvests occur earlier than those in the temperate, mid-Atlantic region of the United States. The long, brutal winters arrive quickly. By the time late November rolls around, much of Canada is already in the icy grip of deep winter, making travel difficult and outdoor feasts impossible. It was a matter of agricultural logistics. If you're celebrating the harvest, you must do it when the harvest is in, which is clearly October. You notice how different the tone is. While American Thanksgiving became inextricably linked to the narrative of the Pilgrim Fathers and their specific settlement narrative, Canadian Thanksgiving was always more fluid. Adopting influences from British tradition, harvest festivals, and the idea of a national day of thanks for military success, and the realities of a harsher climate. As the Canadian provinces slowly consolidated, the need for a unified national holiday arose. Over the 19th century, the date jumped around the calendar wildly. It was celebrated in January, April, June, and even December. For a while, it was often tied to the anniversary of the Queen's birthday, or the end of a cholera epidemic. It was like trying to hit a moving target with a soggy bread roll. Finally, after the great success of the Canadian Confederation in 1867, the government began the slow, bureaucratic process of fixing the date. For a time, it was celebrated in the United States and Canada simultaneously, on the last Thursday of November, a legacy of the shared history and the influence of American traditions flowing north. But this shared date was short-lived. A major historical decision was made in 1879. The Canadian Parliament formally declared November 6th as a National Thanksgiving Day. Then, realizing that date was arbitrary, they kept shifting it. For a period, it was celebrated on a Monday in late October, strategically placed near another holiday to create a lovely long weekend. This leads us to the final legislative date. After World War I, in 1921, Thanksgiving was temporarily merged with the observance of Armistice Day, now Remembrance Day, and held on the Monday of the week in which November 11th fell. You can almost hear the soft, polite Canadian outrage at combining a day of remembrance with a day of feasting. It was a logistical compromise that pleased virtually no one. Finally, in 1957, the Canadian Parliament passed a specific act, declaring a day of general thanksgiving to Almighty God for the bountiful harvest with which Canada has been blessed, to be observed on the second Monday in October. This is the fixed, legal reality of the Canadian date. It perfectly acknowledges the reality of the earlier northern harvest and provides a convenient, travel-friendly long weekend. Historians still argue whether the choice of the second Monday in October was purely based on agricultural timing, or if the government strategically chose a Monday to give workers a 3-day weekend, thereby stimulating the economy through early fall travel. It's a very modern problem. Is your holiday about God and gratitude, or about getting an extra day off? You remember the frantic, war-driven nationalizing of the American holiday, and compare it to the more bureaucratic, logistical settling of the Canadian date. One was a national cry of unity, the other a sensible scheduling decision reflecting an earlier harvest season. You are seeing two nations with shared roots diverge, not over ideology, but over the simple, soothing reality of when the grain is ready to be stored away for the winter. This early October date feels gentler, quieter, nestled cozily, just as the leaves are reaching their peak colors. You can almost smell the crisp October air, a scent that is perfect for drifting off. You are now smoothly navigating back to the United States, but you're moving fast, right into the economic turmoil of the Great Depression. The time is the 1930s, a period marked by anxiety, unemployment, and the desperate need for economic stimulus. You feel the atmosphere of urgency and worry, a stark contrast to the gentle, reflective pace of the 19th century observances. The date of American Thanksgiving, set by Lincoln's precedent as the last Thursday in November, suddenly becomes a matter of intense commercial and political dispute. As you observed earlier, the number of Thursdays in November fluctuates. Sometimes 4, sometimes 5. When the month has 5 Thursdays, the holiday falls very late, sometimes as close as November 29th or 30th. This means a drastically compressed Christmas shopping season between Thanksgiving and Christmas Day. You watch as retailers, the engine of the recovering economy, become increasingly frantic. They believed that a shortened shopping season would severely dampen consumer spending, thereby slowing the entire recovery. They began lobbying the government aggressively to move the date earlier. This leads us to the critical, controversial decision made by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a mainstream historical fact known colloquially as Franksgiving. In 1939, November had 5 Thursdays. Thanksgiving was scheduled for November 30th. Department store chains descended upon Washington, urging FDR to save Christmas sales. Roosevelt, ever the political pragmatist and deeply concerned with economic recovery, agreed to move the holiday 1 week earlier, proclaiming the 3rd Thursday of November as Thanksgiving. You witness the immediate, chaotic backlash. The decision was not only controversial, it was farcical. Imagine the confusion spreading across the country. States' rights were invoked, traditionalists were furious, and the calendar was thrown into utter disarray. Some governors, particularly those who were staunch Republican opponents of the Democratic President Roosevelt, refused to comply. They argued the president had no authority to unilaterally change a tradition enshrined by Lincoln and custom. The result: the country had 2 Thanksgivings. This is the truly quirky tidbit of this era. About half the states, 22 of them, followed the president's proclamation and celebrated on the 3rd Thursday. The other half, either out of tradition or political spite, stuck to the original date, the last Thursday. 3 states were so confused they even celebrated both days. You can almost hear the conversations. Are we eating turkey this week or next week? Well, if you live in New York, it's this week. But if you're visiting family in Connecticut, it's next week. College football schedules were thrown into chaos because rival teams in different states were celebrating on different days. Calendar manufacturers, already under pressure from the Depression, had to print 2 sets of calendars. Try explaining that to a time traveler. A holiday so controversial that people printed different calendars just to spite the president. The gentle humor of the situation lies in the fact that the entire logistical nightmare was created a purely economic calculation. About how many days people have to buy toys and sweaters. The experiment was an unequivocal political and social failure, even if it might have given a slight, fleeting boost to sales. FDR repeated the proclamation in 1940 and 1941, but the Franksgiving dates continued to sow confusion and division. The nickname Franksgiving itself, a slightly tongue-in-cheek term, perfectly captured the public's mild annoyance at the perceived executive meddling with a beloved tradition. Historians still argue whether the economic impact of the earlier date truly justified the social and cultural division it created, or if the change merely shifted sales and had no net positive effect on the economy. Regardless, the confusion was unsustainable. The American had briefly and disastrously become unsettled again. Roosevelt, recognizing the enduring power of tradition over short-term commercial concerns, admitted the error. The solution, however, required the ultimate stabilization of federal law. You watch as the problem moves from the executive branch, presidential proclamation, to the legislative branch, Congress, a more permanent and stabilizing solution for the date. The stage is set for the final, definitive resolution of the American Thanksgiving date, ensuring that this particular calendar controversy would never return. You can almost feel the gentle, rhythmic hum of a congressional committee settling down to deliberate, a sound of bureaucracy achieving final peace. The headache of Franksgiving finally pushed the American government toward a permanent, legal solution. You watch as the issue, stripped of its wartime urgency and economic panic, enters the methodical, dull machinery of the U.S. Congress. The objective is to permanently fix the date, removing it from the annual uncertainty of a presidential proclamation and the whims of a fluctuating calendar or a retail lobby. You are floating now in Washington, D.C., in the early 1940s. The air is heavy with the subtle, musty smell of legislative archives, a scent that promises permanence and endless, gentle paperwork, the perfect atmosphere for falling asleep. In 1941, both the House and the Senate began considering joint resolutions to establish a statutory date for Thanksgiving. This is the crucial, mainstream historical fact. The holiday transitioned from a custom based on Lincoln's precedent to a federal law. The debates were not about tradition versus modernity. They were about the calendar and commerce. They needed a date that was consistent, honored the tradition of a late November harvest, and, most importantly, provided a reliable window for Christmas shopping. The solution finally coalesced around a simple, non-controversial proposal: the fourth Thursday of November. This specific phrasing neatly solved the Thursday problem that plagued the last Thursday rule. You watch as the bill slowly, methodically, makes its way through the legislative process. On December 26, 1941, just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the U.S. into World War II, President Roosevelt signed Public Law 77-379. This is the final definitive law. It declares that Thanksgiving Day is to be observed annually on the fourth Thursday of November. This act officially standardized the holiday nationwide, legally binding all federal entities, and, by strong custom, all states to the same calendar date. The irony here is gentle but profound. The American date was finally and permanently settled, not by a grand gesture of thanks, but by a precise bureaucratic solution to an economic problem, enacted during the chaos of a world war. The low, steady hum of the legislative process, achieving this seemingly minor task, is a truly soothing historical sound. Now for a quirky tidbit from the immediate aftermath of this standardization. Though the date was fixed, the time of the holiday meal became subject to an intense, localized cultural debate. In the South, where dinner historically meant the midday meal, many families continued to serve their Thanksgiving feast at 100 p.m. or 200 p.m. In the North and West, influenced by later factory work schedules and evening leisure time, the tradition shifted to a late afternoon or early evening feast, sometimes as late as 600 p.m. You could be traveling across state lines on the fourth Thursday of November and find yourself either eating lunch or watching the families still preparing the main course. The when of the holiday was fixed, but the when of the meal remained stubbornly regional. As you reflect on this final standardization, you realize the enduring complexity of its origins. Historians still argue whether the ultimate successful passage of the 1941 law was primarily driven by the consensus that Lincoln's legacy needed formalization, or if the overriding fear of repeating the Franksgiving debacle of 1939-1941 provided the necessary political momentum to compromise and settle the issue permanently. It's a gentle debate about the motives behind bureaucratic action. Fear of failure versus desire for order. You can now rest easy knowing that the American calendar, at least for this particular holiday, is entirely settled. No more presidential proclamations, no more dueling state celebrations. The fourth Thursday in November, a date defined by the slow, steady rhythm of congressional action and the careful avoidance of 5 Thursday months, is permanent. You hear the soft, repetitive stamp of the official seal on the document, a sound of historical closure, beckoning you toward a deeper, quieter sleep. However, the story of Thanksgiving's date is not purely American and Canadian. You are now drifting towards the shores of West Africa, where a completely different set of historical circumstances led to a similar, yet unique, November observance. You are now embarking on a journey across the Atlantic, far from the chilly harvests of New England and Canada, landing softly on the coast of West Africa, in the nation of Liberia. The air here is warm, humid, and carries the faint, persistent scent of the ocean and lush tropical flora. This is the crucial, fascinating link between the American tradition and an entirely separate national observance of Thanksgiving. Liberia's very existence is a mainstream historical fact rooted in American history. It was founded in 1822 by the American Colonization Society, ACS, as a settlement for free-born African Americans and formerly enslaved people seeking a homeland. These settlers, often referred to as Americo, Liberians brought their culture, their religion, and, crucially, their calendar of holidays with them. When the settlers established the Republic of Liberia in 1847, they adopted many American institutions, including a bicameral legislature, a currency, and a foundational set of national holidays. Among these imported customs was the observance of Thanksgiving. However, the reason for the holiday quickly adapted to the unique challenges of the new nation. While the American Thanksgiving was cemented by bountiful harvests and political unity, the Liberian version became focused on gratitude for safe passage and survival against the backdrop of establishing a new life in an unfamiliar land, often fraught with tension, disease, and conflict. It was a repeated, collective acknowledgement of Providence for enduring their challenging circumstances. The Liberian government formally established the holiday, and for a long time it was observed on the first Thursday of November. This is the key difference you must register. It is a November holiday, reflecting its American roots, but the date is a unique Liberian determination, distinctly separated from the fourth Thursday rule in the U.S. This earlier date was potentially chosen to avoid crowding the calendar with other mid- to late November observances, or simply to establish its own distinct national identity. The gentle, rhythmic cadence of this earlier date feels calm and less commercially driven than its American counterpart. The way Thanksgiving is celebrated in Liberia also adapted to the local environment. providing a beautiful, quirky tidbit instead of the New England-style turkey and stuffing. The Liberian feast centers around local dishes featuring chicken, rice, yams, and palm butter. But the most unique aspect is the harvest basket tradition. On Thanksgiving morning, many Liberians fill a basket with local fruits and crops, bananas, plantains, peppers, and palm oil, and take it to a local church for a special service. The baskets are blessed by the pastor and then auctioned off. The proceeds from this auction are used to support the church and the community, linking the concept of gratitude directly to philanthropy and communal support. It's a gorgeous, practical adaptation of the harvest theme, turning a day off into a day of giving back. You can sense the powerful continuity of tradition being gently woven into a new context. The settlers carried the idea of Thanksgiving across the ocean, but the local environment, economy, and community needs dictated the how and the specific when of the observance. The quiet dedication to this transplanted holiday speaks volumes about the enduring cultural ties between the two nations. Historians still argue whether the Liberian observance of Thanksgiving was maintained primarily as a genuine spiritual tradition imported from the United States, or if its preservation was a conscious effort by the Liberian elite to reinforce cultural separation and identity from the indigenous populations in the 19th century. The celebration endures today, a testament to its cultural resonance, and remains fixed on that first Thursday of November. You feel the Liberian heat and humidity receding, replaced by a swift movement south and east. You are now heading to another island nation, whose Thanksgiving story is not about pilgrims or settlers, but about a sharp, singular moment of international intervention and the subsequent need for national recognition of peace. The transition is swift, moving from the steady, gentle rhythm of cultural evolution to the dramatic, sudden requirement for a day of thanks. Let the sound of the ocean wash over you, a constant, unifying hum, as you prepare to arrive in the Caribbean. You are now drifting swiftly south and east, away from the quiet, rhythmic traditions of Liberia, settling instead over a tiny, vibrant island in the Caribbean, Grenada. The air here is tropical and sweet, smelling of nutmeg and sea breeze, but the history of its Thanksgiving is marked by a sudden, intense burst of modern geopolitical drama. You are witnessing the creation of a Thanksgiving holiday not out of harvest, nor pilgrimage, but out of a specific 20th century military intervention. The genesis of Grenada's holiday is a mainstream historical fact. The U.S.-led invasion of Grenada in October 1983, codenamed Operation Urgent Fury. The invasion followed a bloody internal coup within Grenada's Marxist government. The intervention was controversial, but it ultimately resulted in the restoration of a democratic government. The key to Grenada's Thanksgiving is the immediate aftermath. You watch as a profound sense of relief washes over the populace. Many Grenadians genuinely felt gratitude for the intervention that ended the internal turmoil and violence. The idea to formalize this sense of communal thanks came quickly from the Grenadian people themselves. In a swift legislative move, the government established a new national holiday, Thanksgiving Day, celebrated annually on October 25th. This date is deliberately chosen to coincide with the anniversary of the military action that ended the crisis. This is the crucial distinction. The date is fixed to a specific, non-fluctuating historical event, not to a harvest cycle or a calendar rule. It is a day of national remembrance, a quiet pause for gratitude for the return to peace and stability. The tradition here is much younger and more immediate than the centuries-old observances in North America. You can almost feel the fresh, raw memory of the conflict underpinning the celebration. There are no pilgrims or long-lost traditions. There is just a date cemented in national memory. The concept of Thanksgiving remains the same, a pause for collective gratitude. But the source of the blessing is entirely different. Now for a quirky tidbit about the Grenadian celebration. While not universally observed with the same intensity as the Christmas holiday, the day often involves family gatherings and a celebratory meal. However, the meal often focuses less on the traditional turkey and more on hearty, local Caribbean cuisine, such as oil down, Grenada's national dish, a rich, savory stew of salted meat, breadfruit, coconut milk, and spices. The spirit of the day, therefore, blends the serious tone of historical remembrance with the warmth and richness of local culinary pride, a beautiful fusion of imported concept and indigenous flavor. Imagine celebrating a national holiday with a stew so rich and comforting. It practically demands a deep, immediate nap, a perfect fit for our theme. The placement of the date in October coincidentally aligns it closer to the Canadian tradition than the American one, proving that sometimes history and logistics just happen to agree. The Grenadian Thanksgiving is a unique example of how a nation can spontaneously create a day of thanks around a single, pivotal moment of transition. Historians still argue whether the enduring status of Grenada's Thanksgiving Day is primarily due to genuine popular support for marking the return to peace, or if its maintenance is an official acknowledgement of the close political and economic ties the nation has subsequently maintained with the United States. Regardless, the 25th of October remains their fixed date. You have now witnessed 3 distinct ways the date is chosen. The United States, bureaucratic fixation on the 4th Thursday of November to accommodate commerce. Canada's pragmatic alignment with the second Monday in October for an earlier harvest. And Grenada's choice of October 25th, fixed to a historical military anniversary. The sound of gentle waves lapping against the Grenadian shore is a final, calming sound, guiding you to the last segment of our journey, where we will briefly explore global harvest echoes. Leaving the specific, fixed dates of the Americas and Liberia behind, you are now floating across the immense tapestry of human history, realizing that the impulse for Thanksgiving is universal, even if the when is wildly inconsistent. You are searching for harvest and gratitude festivals around the globe, noticing how similar themes are expressed on vastly different dates, providing a comforting, repetitive rhythm to global history. The simple, mainstream historical fact is that almost every agricultural society has a festival designed to express thanks for a successful harvest or a successful hunt. These celebrations are always dictated by local climate and agricultural timetables, demonstrating that the calendar of gratitude is fundamentally ecological. Consider Sukkot, the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles. This is a week-long festival of thanks for the autumn harvest, and it typically occurs in late September or early October. You watch as families build temporary, leafy structures called sukkahs, and you feel the gentle, temporary nature of the dwelling, reminding observers of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness. The structure and the timing are deeply symbolic, tying the harvest directly to spiritual and historical memory. The date itself is based on the lunar Hebrew calendar, demonstrating a non-solar approach to fixing the annual celebration. Now drift swiftly eastward to Asia, observing Chuseok in Korea. This major three-day harvest festival is often called Korean Thanksgiving. It falls on the 15th day of the 8th lunar month, which usually translates to a date in September or early October on the solar calendar. You watch families travel en masse to their ancestral homes, giving thanks and paying respect to their ancestors. The focus is on the communal sharing of newly harvested crops, particularly rice. It is a moment of intense familial obligation and culinary celebration, fixed by a lunar cycle that is completely independent of the American November. Next, glance at the Yam Festival in West Africa, particularly among groups like the Igbo people of Nigeria and Ghana. The timing is determined by the local cycle of yam cultivation, typically falling in August. You watch the solemn rituals, the consumption of the first yams of the season, and the community celebrations. The yam is the core staple, and the festival's purpose is to thank the deities for the bounty, and to mark the end of the old cycle and the beginning of the new one. The simple, organic rhythm of this August date is a powerful reminder that the when is always dictated by what the land provides. This global mosaic of gratitude provides a beautiful, quirky tidbit. The common element in all these festivals is the ritual consumption of a key staple crop. In America, it's corn or turkey, a stand-in for wild fowl. In Korea, it's newly harvested rice. In West Africa, it's yams. In Europe, it was traditionally grain or grapes. The time of year changes, but the core act of sharing the first fruits of labor remains constant. It's a repetitive, comforting pattern across continents, designed to soothe the agricultural anxieties of humanity. Historians still argue whether the similarity of these geographically distant harvest festivals proves a deep, cross-cultural, and perhaps innate human psychological need to pause and offer thanks at the end of a resource-gathering cycle, or if the common theme is simply a logical, independent response to the universal rhythm of farming and seasonality. The gentle humming of the various cultural rituals, all expressing the same core gratitude on different days, is the perfect sound for a quiet, reflective sleep. You have now observed the full spectrum of when, from the August yams to the late November turkey, all unified by the same simple impulse. The final section will be a gentle wind down, a smooth glide from these historical specifics into the deep, quiet rhythm of rest. As you drift away from the cacophony of global calendars, you feel the specific dates and legislative details gently blurring into a unified, slow-paced hum. You are no longer focused on the fourth Thursday in November or the second Monday in October, but on the quiet, collective impulse that drove humanity to choose any date at all. You remember the anxious pilgrims, grateful simply for surviving a bitter winter, and the precise, weary scratch of Lincoln's pen during a war, trying to stitch a fractured nation back together with a shared meal. You recall the methodical, almost boring efficiency of the U.S. Congress, finally fixing the date with a law to appease department stores, and the sensible, early logic of the Canadian date, dictated by the swift arrival of the North's harsh cold. All of these stories, all of these dates, are about a profound, shared need, the need to pause. To stop the frantic pace of survival or commerce or politics, and simply acknowledge that things could be worse. The when was always a compromise between religious duty, climate reality, and economic pressure. You feel the pace of the narration slowing, the words growing softer. Let the gentle repetition of the historical struggle to find the right date relax your mind. You are witnessing the end of a long, confusing journey through calendars and continents, a journey that has delivered you safely to this moment of quiet, historical clarity. The most mainstream historical fact of all is this: whether you celebrate on the third Monday in October, the first Thursday in November, or the fourth Thursday, you are participating in a tradition that is essentially identical to the earliest Sumerian, Egyptian, and Chinese harvest celebrations. The date changes, but the emotion is eternal. The final quirky tidbit to ease your mind: in 1909, the territory of Hawaii officially celebrated its own unique Thanksgiving date on the last Thursday of November, following the presidential proclamation. When Hawaii achieved statehood in 1959, they simply adopted the federal law of the fourth Thursday, cementing their place within the national pattern. It was an easy, gentle, and non-controversial end to their calendar conundrum, a perfect note of quiet resolution. Historians still argue whether the ultimate, universal appeal of a fixed holiday is its spiritual meaning, or simply the logistical comfort it provides. The knowledge that no matter what chaos the year brings, that specific day is set aside for home, rest, and food. The quiet, gentle hum of tradition, once established, is almost impossible to disrupt, providing a soothing, predictable rhythm to the year. The dates have settled now. The calendars are aligned. The long journey through the history of when is complete. The low, constant hum of the historical clock is winding down now. You can let the specifics fade, the dates, the names, the legislative acts. Let your mind focus only on the quiet rhythm of the past, the gentle, repetitive motion of the seasons turning, the constant, predictable cycle of harvest and rest. The air is still now. The sounds of all the different countries and all the different centuries receding into a single, soft murmur. You are safe here, floating gently in the quiet space between awareness and sleep. There is only the softness of the air, the steady beat of time, and the deep, deep calm of having reached the end of the story. There are no more dates to worry about, no more calendars to consult, just the profound silence of rest. Let the final historical whisper fade entirely into the silence and drift away completely.